Hey guys, Io here with part 3 of the Rating UI Essentials Workshop and Tutorial. Today we're going to be covering an add-on called WeakAuras, which is one of the more important add-ons, and it manages event notifications. For the tutorial today, we're going to set up this add-on using a Fire Mage instead of the Holy Priest. This is because it's a little easier to see with a lot of procs and stuff to track on this particular character. However, the add-on settings that we had from the previous two videos are still exactly the same. The only difference is we took the voodoo panels, which were centralized in the middle of the screen for our healer, and we just moved them down into corner here since this character is a DPSer and doesn't need those rain frames in the way. Now, WeakAuras is an add-on that's uniquely powerful because it can be used to track and notify you of virtually anything that's happening or is going to happen to you in combat. In general, it's very useful to track procs, dots, internal cooldowns, whether that's from a trinket or something with a class, such as Rapture for a Disciplined Priest. It could be used to track buffs, debuffs, all manner of things, and you can customize the output. So you basically think of anything that could happen in combat that you would want to be notified of, and then you tell WeakAuras how to display a notification when that happens or is about to happen. So to get started, access WeakAuras by typing /WeakAuras in chat. Note that there is no minimap icon for this button. When you bring up the WeakAuras menu, which can be dragged around the screen freely, you'll notice there are two frames to start with. On the left, there will be a list where you can select New to create a new WeakAura, or you'll have a list of all your previously created WeakAuras. Note that WeakAuras are saved on a count, but you can choose which ones to load per character. So when you load WeakAuras, you're going to see all the ones you have for any of your tunes. On the right, you'll see all the different types of either WeakAuras or grouping settings that you can create. Now, it's important to note that while it looks like there are a lot of options here, they're all very, very similar in setup. So they essentially break down into the following: progress texture, model, text, icon, and progress bar are all forms of a display. So they'll be set up in the same fashion in terms of a trigger, what will cause them to be shown. And the only difference is how they're actually showing you information. So a texture and a progress texture are actually almost exactly the same, except if you're talking about something like a trinket buff that will last for a certain amount of time, this one would just show you, hey, this buff is up, versus this one could show you, this is up, and it would shrink down or gray out as it's about to expire. But in terms of setup, they're almost identical. The other ones here, dynamic group and group, are just used to put a collection of different WeakAuras together. And you can do those for a couple of reasons. You can, say, have all of your Mage WeakAuras together in a group called Mage, and then you can set that group to only activate when you load a certain character. The last option here, import, is a way to copy and paste in a text string. So if you have another mage, if I'm running mine and you're on yours, and you like a particular aura that I have or that I tell you about, I can actually email you a string that will look like just completely random text characters, but you can copy and paste that into WeakAuras here, and it will automatically load my WeakAura into your computer. So to get started, we're first going to make a progress bar WeakAura for Invoker's Energy, a DPS buff that mages who talent into it should be keeping up nearly 100% of the time. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do to create that aura is click progress bar. And you'll see it'll give you an option to create it over here. The first thing we're going to do is name it. We'll call it Invokers. And hit enter to make sure it saves that text field. Now, there are multiple tabs here. The first two we're going to be concerned with are display and trigger. Within the display tab, you have all the options to customize the output of whatever your aura is. So how it looks, how it will show up on your screen, or what it will do. And actually what we're going to do is we can drag this entire window to the side of our screen, alright, so that we can see the aura that we just created in the middle here. This is a sample, just to show you what you're working with, and you can drag and drop it as you like. Note that while there are also resizing options within the display tab, it's much easier to just drag the corners of an aura and resize it that way. So we're going to put this right where our raid frames were on our Holy Priest. Okay. Now, before we continue customizing this any further, we're going to go over to the Trigger tab and define to the computer what's going to activate this aura. Now, while we're going to make a progress bar aura for invokers here right now, I'm going to first take a minute to go over these trigger settings in detail, because they're generally the hardest and most confusing settings to get right within WeakAuras. The first item to look at is the aura trigger type up here, and it's the first item in the window. And if you click the down arrow, you can see that there are 4 types of triggers that you can choose between. Aura is a collective word that refers to both buffs and debuffs. Custom allows you to enter a custom text string if the other ones aren't sufficient. Generally, you won't ever need to use this, and in the entire time I've used WeakAuras, I've never had to use a custom string. An event is just what it sounds like. It's an event. It's something that happens during combat that's going to trigger the aura. In general, it's something that will happen for an instant and then not have a status following it. This is most often used to track things from the combat log. So, for example, if I were on a Disciplined Priest, when I cast a power word shield, if that shield is entirely consumed, I can be energized with Rapture to gain mana back. However, this can only happen once every 12 seconds, and there's no buff or debuff that you can track that will let you know, hey, this can't happen again for another X number of seconds. Instead, what you could do is, through this setting, you could choose to set off a timer for 12 seconds, the internal cooldown of Rapture, and you could trigger that timer every time you're energized with mana from Rapture. This would be an example of an event. A status, again, is just what it sounds like. It is a state of being on your character or another NPC or whoever it is you're referring to. Now, if you click the drop-down menu here, you can see that there is a whole list of different statuses, and these can range from anything from cooldown progresses to an amount of energy, alternate power, if you have a certain amount of threat, if your global cooldown is in a certain state, whatever it is. In general, the most common settings you're going to look for in here are cooldown progresses, either on an item or a spell, so you could track how far the cooldown is, or just have an icon pop up when, say, a spell is ready or on cooldown. And power. Now, power refers to whatever the energy for your class is. So, for me as a mage, it is mana. However, if I had a warrior, power could be rage. Alright, so if we select that real quick, we can see that there's also extra checkboxes, and this is true for whatever you select. The additional options will change depending on which one you choose, but they're to help refine your criteria. So in this case, I could check the box, and I have to tell it that the power type here is mana. If I were on a warrior, again, that would be rage, or for a rogue, focus. Or energy, rather. Apologies. Alright, and I can set more criteria here to say, you know what, if my mana is less than a certain percent, show me an aura reminding me to cast Evocation. These settings would be particularly useful for, say, a warrior who, at above 80 rage, wants to make sure something's notifying, reminding him, hey, you're about to cap your rage. Use something like a heroic strike so you don't accidentally keep building rage and waste it. Now, you'll see the setup of various types of triggers as we go through, because we're going to set up a couple of auras, and we'll move quicker and quicker after each one. For now, though, we're setting up a tracking aura for the Invoker's buff. So the status is going to be aura, and we'll go see our further options. First, the unit that we're going to target is us, the player, since we're tracking a buff on us, and the aura type is naturally a buff. Note that if your aura doesn't seem to be working and you think you have all the settings right, double check the aura type setting here for buff or debuff. Now, I'm tracking invokers, but if I accidentally had this set to debuff, even though they're both auras on it, because of just for programming reasons, it won't work unless the proper one is selected. So the invokers is a buff, and I don't really care about the remaining time. Remember, this is criteria, so the bar is going to track the time, but if I were to set an operator here, then it would tell the aura to only show up if, say, I had less than 10 seconds left on the buff, which you could do, but that's not what we're going to do here. Note also down here the own only option. This is more important for dots and certain heals, but when you create a weak aura, you're defining a trigger. So if I were, say, making a living bomb weak aura to notify me that my living bomb is in fact on the target, I would have to define it further, saying my own living bomb. Because if there are multiple mages in your raid, and any one of them puts Living Bomb on your target, then the weak aura would show up to tell you that it's there. But really what you're interested in is tracking your own Living Bomb. So this is the option that would let you refine that. Now, once you have all these settings confirmed, what you actually want to do is define what the aura, the item that you're tracking is. So in this case, we're going to be tracking the Invoker's buff. Note that this is the actual name of the buff, debuff, the aura that will appear, generally appear in your buff bar. Right? It's not the name of the trinket or ability that necessarily casts the spell. So, for example, the spell here that I would cast to gain the buff is Evocation. But the aura name that I'm tracking is not. The buff's name is actually Invoker's Energy. So that's what I have to type in. And note that if I type it correctly, when I hit OK here, it will search for it, and it didn't find the match. And that's actually because I misspelled invokers. There's an apostrophe, so it has to be written exactly as the buff is written. So now that it's written exactly how the buff would appear, including the apostrophe, if I click OK, it'll see it found a match. Don't be concerned if it finds multiple matches. That will happen occasionally. So now, in summary, what we've done on this tab is we've defined an aura. So this aura, or this weak aura, will appear when Invoker's energy buff is on the player, myself. Alright, that's the only criteria we have. And you can see in the sample bar, it's also automatically changed to set the icon to Invoker's energy. Now that we have our trigger set up, we're going to go back to the display tab, and we're going to customize the look a little bit. So, first of all, note that in the text, you can either type text itself, so if I were to just type hello in here and hit OK, it can show that text. But the more useful options here are dynamic settings, and if you hover over the text box, you can see some of the options. In general, one of the most useful ones to you is going to be %p, and that will show you the progress or remaining time of a buff or whatever it is that might be ticking away. You can also have this show stacks, the total duration, any number of things. There's even a custom Lua editing section. We'll set the text to show the name of the buff, Invoker's Energy, and the remaining time on the buff. So what we'll do is as the left text, we'll do %, and n, okay, and then I'll make it show the name of the buff. And the right text is already showing %p, the remaining time on the buff. Now, what we'll also do is, this bar looks a little bit ugly. I'm not a fan of the red, so we'll go down and we can change some coloring here. So if you see here, there's an option for bar color. Let's change the countdown bar to match the color of the Invoker's icon. That looks pretty good. Now, in addition, since I really want to be aware of how much is left on the buff and how much is draining, I want to see the full length of that bar and how much or how fast it's decreasing, so I'm going to set a background color on it as well. So if I go here, and remember this is transparency, I'm going to change the color slider to white, and I'm going to make it very opaque. Maybe we'll go a little bit grayer than that. That looks good. So now on the bar, you can very clearly see that Invoker's energy would be up and how quickly it's decreasing. All right. Now, there are additional options in here that you could change the text font, color, size. It's all very straightforward, and if you want to change any of that, feel free to go through and customize it to whatever appearance you like. In general, the only other option that I change is the bar texture. I'm not a huge fan of the default Blizzard one here. But note that especially if you have Voodoo installed, you'll have plenty of options for customization. I'm going to go with, I think, Concave Light here. And you'll notice it just changed the shading of the bar a little bit. Now, if we close out of WeakAuras here, we'll cast Evocation. You'll notice that it disappeared because the criteria for it isn't active right now. We don't have the buff up, and therefore it won't show. But if we cast Evocation, when it finishes channeling, we'll get the buff. And you can see that Invoker's energy is active, and our weak aura is working. It's slowly counting down. So if you were in combat right now, you'd be very well aware of how much time you had left before you needed to cast an Evocation again. I'm going to click off this buff here, and we'll open up the WeakAuras menu again. Next, I'm going to make 2 more WeakAuras of the same type, both progress bars, to track Pyroblast and heating up procs. two procs that are very important for the Fire Mage rotation. And I'll go through this much more quickly. So new, progress bar. Alright, for the first one we'll use it to track Pyroblast. And it found it. Now, one option here is we automatically used the default icon for the Invoker's energy, and it defaults to whatever spell is triggering the aura to choose the icon. But you can just uncheck automatic here, and then you can choose whichever one you like. So I'm actually going to choose the icon for the Pyroblast spell, rather than the clear casting state. Right. Make this a little bit wider here. A bit smaller. And perfect. Right. And note that the trigger is the buff for Pyroblast. Everything there can stay the same. And our display looks just fine. Although, we'll have the bar built into the middle, and note that you can change the orientation as well. So we're going to have it build from, I think left to right. Right to left looks good. And we'll just switch the icon. There we go. Alright, I'll name this Pyroblast. Alright, create one more. Note that while it did disappear, you can just use the eyes to toggle. This one heating up. Trigger it with the heating up buff on the player. All these settings look good. Alright. Now, instead of just resizing this manually, I'm going to use the same dimensions as the Pyroblast icon to kind of balance out the look of it. And if I go down, I can see that the width is 101 and the height is 30. So I'll change this to match. Perfect. And I'll change the bar orientation and the icon from left to right. So now the icons are both more central and the bars are building toward the middle. And note that if you're having trouble with the drag and drop positioning, at the very bottom here, there's also offset settings. So I could manually change this to get it just right. Now that I'm starting to get a good number of auras going here, what we're going to do next is create a group. Now, there are two types of groupings, the normal group and a dynamic group. I'll do a further guide on dynamic groupings later. They can automatically adjust positioning, so if you've ever used an add-on that shows you progress bars and they collapse to a single point, you can do that same thing with the dynamic group, but just for the ease of getting started, we're going to go with a regular one. And we'll name this Mage. This way, I'm going to keep all of my auras for this character together, because remember, if you log in on an alt, WeakAuras will save all of your auras across all characters into its settings. Now, once you've created a group, to put other auras into it, you can just click this little arrow here, and then click the group name. There we go. Note that if you expand it, you'll see all your auras here, and if for any reason you want to bring your auras back out of that group, if you put it into the wrong one, you can just select it and click this little ungroup back arrow, and it will bring it out. Another advantage to putting things into groups is that when they're together, if you move them around, they'll all be moved together as one unit. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to create a different kind of weak aura here, just a plain icon. Now remember, the setup in terms of triggering is going to be pretty much the same as the other ones. The only difference is going to be the display type. And since this one's just a plain icon, there isn't going to be a progress bar. Let's turn the display for that back on. Now, what I'm going to do here, and I'm setting up all of my DPS tracking on the bottom of the Invoker's energy bar here, is I also want to be able to track whether my Inferno Blast is off cooldown and if I have my Living Bomb on a target. So first, I'm going to do a Living Bomb aura tracking. All right, so I'm going to resize this down so it fits right in there. Alright, now the trigger, since I'm using Living Bomb, It's also going to be an aura. The aura name would be Living Bomb. And it finds it. Don't worry if there are multiple matches. Again, that's completely normal. Alright. However, this time, the unit, the targeted unit, is not the player. Alright? It's the target. And this is a debuff, not a buff. Alright? Note also that I have to check own only, or else anytime any mage's Living Bomb is on the target, this aura will activate, and I'm only interested in knowing if mine is on for my DPS. So I'll check own only. Now if we go back to display, note that this icon here isn't really the one that we would associate with Living Bomb, so I'm also going to go up, turn off the automatic icon, and look up a different one. There we go. Okay. Now we have an easy to see icon that's going to track if Living Bomb is on our target. And we'll put that right into our mage group. Now we're going to make one more icon for the mage to track here, but this one's going to be a little bit different because we're going to use this to track a cooldown. Now, if we have a heating up buff, we want to get a critical strike, and we can guarantee that with Inferno Blast. So we're going to put these next to each other, so if we see this bar, we want to try to have Inferno Blast ready to go to get us some more DPS. So our trigger here, instead of an aura, is going to be a status. And that status will be if a... let's see. We could do the cooldown progress to track the cooldown left on Inferno Blast, but we're actually going to just see if it's usable. Blast. And it finds it. Good. Okay. Now I think the display is just fine here. So we'll shrink this down. We'll keep that nice and centered in here. Now again, there can be a lot of little tweaking with the positioning, sizing, and placement. But feel free to do that in your spare time. We also have to go up here, give this a name, CD, put it into our mage group. And also don't worry if you see a question mark here for the icon. Sometimes when you're working with the settings, it just has to load it back in, but that's totally normal and it'll revert when it's all set. Now, one thing that I did just notice that I forgot to do is on heating up, you see this number 1 that's showing above it. That's because on the icon, if we go to the heating up macro here, if we scroll down, there's an option for stacks. So it could track stacks of the debuff, which would show on top of the icon. In the case of heating up, you can't have stacks of it, so we can just uncheck that and it'll disappear. We can do the same thing for Living Bomb as well. And here actually it's going to be as text since it's not a progress bar. But we'll just change that to timer. And actually what you can see is that's more useful to us since there is no progress bar for the mage bomb. If we change it to %T, or excuse me, %P, which will track the progress, and we can make sure that we see that text nice and clear. Now that's going to count down and tell you exactly how much time is left on your mage bomb, in addition to telling you that it's actually active. Now that we've set up some class-specific WeakAuras to track things like procs and cooldowns, we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at trinkets, internal cooldowns, and procs. Now it's important to track the cooldown of your trinkets and major spells because their effect when used together is synergistic. So if you have 2 trinkets and you use them separately, the effect on, say, your DPS will not be as great as if you were to use them together. The balance comes in deciding if it's worth it to wait a couple of seconds to use a trinket, or if you should just use that trinket on cooldown because over the course of the fight you'll get more uses in. Now, if you use a trinket with an on-equip effect, That effect has a certain chance of being activated with, say, every spell or melee swing, whatever it happens to be. Once that trinket activates, there's something called an internal cooldown, a certain amount of time that must pass before that trinket is allowed to activate again. This amount of time can be looked up on Wowhead or just determined through testing on a target dummy. In general, it's easiest just to look it up. What we're going to do is we're going to set up 5 auras very quickly. One aura is going to tell us if our weapon enchant has procced and is active. One's going to be to tell us if our trinket 1 proc is active. One will be for our trinket 2 proc. And then since my first trinket is an on-use effect, I will track its cooldown with 1 progress bar. And then since the other trinket is an on-equip, I'm going to set a combat log trigger and track its internal cooldown using a different type. Alright, so let's get started. I'm going to use just an icon for my weapon enchant, and the trigger is Windsong. This isn't a perfect aura because Windsong actually has 3 different types of procs that can go off. If I wanted to narrow that down, I could just use the spell ID instead, and you can find spell IDs by looking them up on Wowhead. So I'll make this 40 by 40. Let's make it a little smaller. Perfect. Now I'm going to change this to %p so I can see the progress, and that way the text inside will tell us how much time is left on that buff. I'll center it and make the text a bit larger. Okay. Alright, that one's good. Name it Windsong. Next, I'm going to make another icon for my Flashfrozen Resin Globule. Now, I don't remember what the buff that gives me is called, so I can actually just use my trinket and I'll check. And it's called Flash Freeze, because remember, the buff is not the same as the trinket name. I could also look this up. Right, so the trigger for this is going to be Flash Freeze. Okay, and again, it's a buff on me, the player, so those are all fine. Alright, I'm going to click the eye here, turn these other ones back on. Right, and I'll put that on this side. Now my other Windsong one was 38 by 38, so I'll change this to match 38 by 38, and I'll put that right in next to it. Name this Trinket 1. And again, by naming this Trinket 1 and Trinket 2, it would be very easy for me later to go through, use the same aura, and it does have the automatic icon, and just change the name of the trinket buff should I get a new trinket later on. Okay. So that's all set up. Now, Flashfrozen Resin Globule is on use, so it has an extrinsic cooldown. You can see it as you do there. So if I make another progress bar here, and call this Trinket 1 CD, right, I'm going to change the left text to the progress, and I'll just get rid of this right text completely because I'll know that the icon next to it, that's just my Trinket 1. I'll get used to it being there. I'll change the bar color to match the Windsong color here. Well, I'm sorry, the Flash Frozen color, which I know is kind of a dark blue. That looks good. I will change the height to be 38 to match the other one. I will turn the icon off, and I'll shrink this down a bit. Okay, that's lined up pretty decently. And I'll change this to T1 ICD to remind me that's tracking the internal cooldown. Or, oops, sorry, CD, cooldown. So now the trigger for this aura, right, is going to be a status, and it's going to be a cooldown progress of an item. And now for the item, remember, I'm actually tracking the cooldown on the item itself, so I'm going to use the name of it, not the buff, and that's Flashfrozen Resin Globule. I can hit OK, and it found it. Okay, so that looks good. Now, I'm going to make one more. We'll start with the trinket 2. So my trinket 2 is the Essence of Terror. Now the buff the Essence of Terror gives when it's on use of, or on equip effect triggers is called Quickened Tongues. Again, you can just look that up from Rawhead or check the buff on your character when it activates. I'll change the display here to 38 by 38. Put that on the right side here. Now, since this is an on-equip trinket, its cooldown is not going to be obvious. It's hidden from us, but we can still track it. So, what we'll do, and actually before I do that, I'm going to take the buff, change that to %P so I can see the time remaining. Center it. There we go, much better. Yeah. Now what we're going to do is we'll make a progress bar. Remember, we want to track its internal cooldown. So what this will tell us is after we've gained that buff, it's going to tell us the amount of time that has to elapse before that trinket can possibly proc again. And generally trinkets proc fairly quickly. This one's somewhat of an exception. It'll take a couple of swings. It has a low proc rate. But most trinkets will proc within 10 seconds or so of coming off of their internal cooldown. Alright, so we're going to go in and make a progress bar. Now the trigger is going to be a little different this time because it's an internal cooldown of a trinket. So we're going to base it off of a custom event in the combat log. Alright, now this is going to trigger when an aura, the buff, is applied to us. Alright, and the spell name that's going to be applied to us is the name of the buff. So it's Quickened Tongues. Okay. And the aura type, remember we have to tell it that it's a buff. Okay. So what we've told the trigger here is when the combat log registers that the aura, Quickened Tongues, has been applied, it counts as a spell application. Alright, when that buff has been applied, we're going to start this timer. And down here is where we can tell the timer exactly how long it should be. We know because we looked it up, it's 105 seconds. Okay, so that's all of our triggering information, and that will be the same for any internal cooldown that you want to track. The only difference will be generally the spell name. Okay, now under the display tab, we can again customize this a little bit. I'm going to make the right text the progress and left text just T2ICD, so remember that it's tracking the internal cooldown. Okay. We'll change the dimensions here a little bit. Make the height 38. Shrink this down. Let's show the other trinket icon here. Oops. Actually, let's turn off the icon. There's no need for us to see that. Let's just take enough space. There we go. And again, that's actually looking pretty good now. We'll call this trinket to a CD. Right. And I'll just make sure that these are spaced out nicely. Okay. You know what? Let's just change the color here. And we'll make this one, we'll make it match, just so it's somewhat symmetric with the other side. There we go. Alright. So, and again, don't worry if these icons have question marks at a given moment. They will update and will look proper when they activate. All right. So, that took a little bit of time, but let's review what we've seen here. Okay, so we've set up a bar to track Invoker's energy, one of the most important mage buffs to keep up at all times. We have bars that can track any of the procs that are critical for our DPS. We also have 3 icons that are telling us when we have our most powerful buffs or trinket buffs up, so we can time our cooldowns from when we see a lot of these. And once our trinkets have procced, we can also see from these cooldown timers on the side how much time is left before we can get those trinket procs again. Now the last thing I want to review real quick is some of these load effects. Alright? Now, one of the advantages of keeping all of your auras for a class in one group, and on that note I'm actually going to move the ones that are not in the right group into our mage group. There we go. Is now I can collapse these down and say this mage group here. Obviously it's not going to let me change the triggers and displays, and you shouldn't while looking at the group, because that would apply the changes to the whole group, and they're very different auras. What you can do from here though is you can change the load effects. Alright? And these are definitions of when you want these icons to show. So naturally these are all combat based. We only want these to show while we're in combat. In addition, these are all of our mage-specific combinations, so I'm going to check this and say only load these when I'm on my mage. What this does is now when I load onto an alternative character, so say back to my priest, what's going to happen is it won't automatically load all of these icons into my priest. Because remember, like this Inferno Blast icon will show whenever Inferno Blast isn't on cooldown. Alright, and while if we check action usable, that shouldn't cause conflict on a priest, sometimes things can be funny. This just keeps it nice and clean and will make your life a lot easier when you have alts. Now with that in mind, let's close this out and go give this a try and see what it looks like in combat. So if I fly down to the target dummies here, and here we go. So to get started, I'll evocate and throw out a mage bomb. You can see the auras come right up. I can see that I got heating up. I used Inferno Blast. I got a free Pyroblast. I can see that I have 2 trinket proc, and my weapon enchant. So this is going to be a huge crit. If it goes through, I got another Pyroblast. Heating up again. If I use Inferno Blast, here we go. I know I have a Pyroblast. And I'm a bad mage, I let my living bomb fall off, but as soon as I reapply it, you can see all the timers come up there. So you can see once you get used to a system like this, it provides you with a lot of extra information, and can be very, very helpful to maximizing your DPS. If I were, say, trying to set up for a combustion, I would wait until I had a pocket Pyroblast there. I might even want to see if I could get these trinkets to come up right away. Because I can see I have a minute before the other trinket could proc, I know that's not going to happen, but my other one's off cooldown, so I know I could at least get a buff series of Pyroblasts out with that first trinket, maybe even my weapon enchant. So, anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this guide. I hope it will be very helpful to you in maximizing your healing, DPS, or reducing your damage taken, whatever it happens to be. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below, and enjoy. I'll see you for the next part in the Rating UI workshop and tutorial series. Take care, guys.